Welcome everybody. Thank you. Good afternoon. And just to give a little context, I mean, right, we live in a globalized society. As in the 21st century, we're becoming more interconnected where through social media, through interactions, people all across the globe are actually becoming more interactive with us, and where issues that may affect one general area or one country can actually affect us in a local context over here. And a prime example is with this pandemic. We've all gone through various experiences with this pandemic that's impacted us in different ways. And we are just going to shed some light on this and share a light on terms of, because we're shaping into a more globalized society, how international education is important to make you become more empowered as a better global citizen. So to start off, I want to introduce myself, Troy Deutsch Jr., then introduce my father, Troy Deutsch Sr. And we're going to just start with the topic of COVID-19. Dad, I know him as Dad, so I'm going to introduce him as that. Dad, we understand that how in the past year and a half, COVID-19 has had a tremendous impact on us globally, but nationally and locally, particularly here. And give us a little bit of context. How do you think COVID-19 was politicized?
The politicization didn't start out that way. If you recall, it was more of a PR thing. Trump was running for re-election. His big thing was making sure he had a strong economy. Most experts said that would be the way that he win. People would forgive him for all the other faults that he had. But if you had a strong economy and people wasn't pocketbooks felt better, they would feel better, and he would win re-election. As we know now that he knew how serious the virus was, with Bob Woodward's tapes, he said he always wanted to downplay the virus. The reason that he wanted to downplay it is that he wanted the economy to move along and didn't want people to feel it at the pocketbook so he could win re-election. However, once people start getting sick, and the Democrats start asking questions and the nation started asking questions about this pandemic, it started to become politicized, because that's when he said it was a Democratic hoax. When he said that it was a Democratic hoax, his supporters believed that's what it was, that the virus wasn't as serious as it was. We didn't have a strategy to combat the pandemic. We didn't have a pipeline to actually get PPEs and make sure people were being protected. So politicization started then. And remember, it became an issue about what states were opening up their economies, and that the blue states were not opening up their economies because it would hurt. That's the way they wanted to hurt Trump, and that's the way they were going to take the election away from him. People who didn't understand that. If you're a governor, you have to have a balanced budget. So it made no sense for governors who were coming up for re-election to shut down their economies, because they couldn't have, remember, there was a lot of crisis, even here in New Jersey. We were wondering how the schools were going to stay open, because could we pay the teachers? How could we pay our police officers? How could we pay our first responders? So that was the discussion that wasn't being had, that it would make no sense for a governor to shut down his own economy, because he would only hurt himself, especially if you're up for a re-election. So that's when it became politicized. And then you had Republicans not paying attention to it as well. So, and then the Democratic side politicization was showing that we're more responsible. That will become a strategy, showing that we're more responsible. That's what Joe Biden ran on, being more responsible than the pandemic than Trump was. And at that point, all bets was off, was us acting as a collective unit, trying to keep each other safe. It became a red state versus blue state type of thing. So once those words were spoken, this was a Democratic hoax, that's when the pandemic came politicized.
Right. And to give context behind it, like he had understanding about the severity of the virus from the beginning, from really the middle to the end of January. He had a meeting with Anthony Fauci, Robert Redfield, who were his two top health officials, his national security and his deputy national security advisor, both Matt Pottinger and Robert O'Brien, who all essentially told him the severity of it. They believed how severe it could be transmitted, and they felt that precautions need to be taken. And at the same time, when he was politicizing and saying that it was a Democratic hoax, this was around February, where he just came out of impeachment. His impeachment hearings just ended. He was trying to continue to do his rallies to start his campaigning for the 2020 election, as well as the fact of him also you had the time of the Super Bowl and the pre-interview, so and the traditional pre-Super Bowl interview that he has on the news, as well as the State of the Union address. So he had ample time to give the information, adequate information out in preparation. In regards to the governors of the states, they had a meeting in January with Fauci and Robert Redfield, 25 governors of 25 states having a meeting discussing the severity of the virus and how they need to take the adequate precautions that to make sure that we were prepared for it. And we know New Jersey, New York, and California were some of the states that were hit, Florida as well, were some of the states that were hit the most, and partially due to the fact that we had people traveling in and out. Those are states that usually have a lot of people coming from just foreign or internal domestic travel, just because they attract a lot of tourism, and those are port areas. California has this port area with its ports and its airport, so does New York and New Jersey. So it definitely shows the severity of how there was adequate time for precautions to be made. However, it was chose for political reasons. And as you highlighted specifically, the economy was really the main driving factor. So how did COVID impact the economy?
But I just wanted to bring another part in it too. Not only was the pandemic politicized, it was also racialized, right?
Right.
Because we started talking about who was the most affected people. It was people of color. Who was the community that they blamed for? It was the Chinese. So not only did they politicize it, they actually colorized it to a sense where people didn't care. If you remember, when it first started, people were scared.
Right.
But once people started realizing that only Black and brown people were the ones paying the price, it was like, why should we wear masks? Why shouldn't we open up the economy? So that became another layer of the hideous way that the pandemic was harmed a lot of people.
I get you. So he made it specifically a racial issue in regards of now you had a good portion of the population really didn't care because they felt like it didn't hinder their community as much as it did others. But again, how do you feel like it impacted the economy? We know, like, for instance, our global supply chain was disrupted. Businesses started shutting down, where only essential businesses like hospitals and grocery stores were the only establishment or the only businesses that were left to be open. We know that there was a robust debate in regards of offering a stimulus package, which was only $1,200 for that 1 month. And then again, in terms of education, where students were talking with teachers in regards of how if teachers should continue to be in school, if they were, what were the precautions that need to take place, and then again, how to adapt with if kids need to be out of school and if teachers need to teach out of school. So how do you feel like it impacted the economy, since the economy, from what you said, was the driving force behind why it was politicized?
Well, the impact of the economy was that people forget that not only did it, once the stock market is hit, is when they started reacting.
Right.
But when people were out of jobs, and one of the discussions was coming up is how it was going to be a big eviction, right? So you have a big homeless population during the pandemic, which would just makes the pandemic worse, right? So what we realized is that, and what it shed a light on, was that it took the color off of the pandemic, because now it was not a color thing. It was actually a rich and a poor thing.
Right.
Those who had means did not feel the pandemic. Matter of fact, we had more billionaires made during the pandemic than any other time. So that shows you that it really affected one portion of a group, which was working class poor people, and that's colorless, right? So what you had was companies shutting down. But the bigger corporations was taken care of. And it was at one time that the Treasury said that we would make sure that certain sectors wouldn't fail, because what they didn't want to happen was what happened during the collapse of Wall Street. So they made sure that those sectors would not collapse. Some hotels were bailed out. The luxury line was bailed out. The airlines were bailed out. They were the first ones with their hands out. But in the European countries, which goes to the international, if you understand it, the European countries, who they call socialists, they paid their people to stay home.
Right.
So some of the reactions that we were having here, where people were going and saying, well, I need to work and you're shutting down my business. They weren't having those issues in Europe as much as they were having here, because they were paying these people to stay home and they were paying them a wage. We gave people $1,200 and at one time, one of the head economic advisors of Trump said $1,200 should last people 6 months. So it shows you how out of touch that some of these people were making the decisions. Then the argument became, if people were unemployed, how much money would we give them? And Democrats said, and people forget how much the fight was, that they didn't want to add any extra to unemployment.
Right.
And Democrats were saying, hey, well, you know, people can't live off of a certain amount. So they settled in at $600.
Right.
So people were getting $600 extra a week. That actually was a Band-Aid. It wasn't a solution, because another reason that the pandemic was not being able to be controlled is we had no infrastructure to help people who were being harmed economically by you know, there was. Then the other issue became the guinea pig of this all was the school teachers.
Right.
Because they had to become the babysitters, because one of the biggest issues was that people was complaining about, how can I work and my kids home and I can't leave my kid because the schools were closed down.
Right.
Right. So the argument then started becoming telling school teachers, where there was no vaccine, that they had to go back in and open up schools. Right. So now it's like, what structure did you have? So now it's like the school teachers unions are looking like, well, our people aren't supermen. Like, how are we being protected? And then the argument, you got to figure like, okay, we'll open up and the vaccine was, but you know, you have to be masked, and we had to have certain type of you know, equipment for the teachers to go back safely. That wasn't happening. Then the nurses were being told to go in, and they didn't have proper PPEs. The doctors was actually getting different PPEs than the nurses was. So then you had that argument. So again, that's an economic structure.
Right.
That's still an economic structure. Service workers were not being protected, but they were told they had to work.
Right. And you feel like they made it racialized in the point to kind of hide away from that, because one of the things they talked about more was just Black and brown people were the ones that were mostly being affected. However, they don't think of the fact that you know the key industries that we're in: education, nursing. You know, some of us were even doctors, bus drivers. Some of us did actually work in the grocery stores. Like I was an essential worker working at Costco. So,
but if you look at those industries, who are the people who? What is the majority? A lot of those come from Black and brown people. Those are those industries, and those are the people who are most affected that you're telling to go back to work.
Exactly, and not trying to give any money to.
Right. And then, so that was one of the things that, you know, economically, you know, the economic impact, again, you go to an economic structure that would have helped save a lot of people, because there was a lot of people that could work from home. If you would have paid people to, you know, and then help people, like, for instance, we had a guy who opened up down the street from us as an Italian restaurant. He opened up during the pandemic, and he was busy as heck because he put in a structure of, he went straight to delivery system, and people were ordering food from him. And you remember, we would go down the street, would be packed. You would have to wait to get food. But a lot of people was having an argument of just trying to keep these restaurants open instead of putting in a structure where they can maintain a certain base of workers, and you know, that will go out and deliver the food when the people will come up and pick up their food. They didn't do that. They were just having an argument of keeping everything open, and a lot of companies closed because of that, because they didn't they didn't have a system to allow them to continue to work.
And I mean, to that point too, like even when you said like the structure in terms of giving money, like remember the Republicans even made a point in saying like, if we keep giving them money to stay home, they're not going to want to go to work.
They're not going to go to work.
So it was like, and I mean, even to the point going further, like where the economy was always a central interest, because they, like you said, they gave Wall Street $6 trillion to keep itself up, because it did almost collapse at least one point in time. But like I remember when they said Trump had in late January, when Trump had that conversation with Robert Redfield, we had it with Anthony Fauci and his two national security advisors. The question that came from one of his top aides, his chief of staff, was like this: was how would it affect the stock market, and how would China react to if we started closing down? So it was in terms of tariffs. So it was never really in regards of having the concern of people at hand. It always kind of had the interest of the economy and keeping it up. And that was partially because, again, Trump knew that that's what he needed in order to win his election. That was what he was campaigning on. That's what he kept promoting his past 4 years, and anybody would overlook in terms of any discrepancies or any issues he had during, or any controversies he had his prior 3 years in office. As long as the economy is doing well and we can promote that
everything
the
will always
economy
be
is doing
forgiven.
well, everything will be forgiven.
Because remember, the presidency is always looked at as what are you polling at, right?
Mm-hmm.
Trump never was a popular president.
Right.
However, he never dipped below a level that you could consider that him not being a viable president, right? He had viability. He didn't tank to like 30%, 35%. He always stayed below, above that 49. He would teeter around 49, never dip below 43. Right. So that's viability. We only got to win a few points. I mean, let's be honest. Biden won Georgia by what, 11,000 votes?
Yeah, 11, it wasn't that much.
So exactly. So he still was he won 74 million votes. Right. So he was always a viable candidate. The thing would be, how would people react if his economy was like worse than, he came in saying Obama had a terrible economy, which was false. And the media allowed that. That was false. Obama had a record stock market. Nobody ever seen the stock market like the one Obama handed over to Trump. And for all of the credit Trump gets for his stock market, and this is recorded. This is fact. His stock market did not perform at the level of Barack Obama's. Right. No one's did. The level of his stock market was a record stock market. That's what he handed over. He also handed over a consecutive month growth of job growth, of like not higher job growth than in the Reagan era, not a higher job growth in the Clinton era. However, they never recorded the month-to-month job growth that he did. He never had he had like 85 straight months of job growth. That was unheard of, right? That's what Trump inherited. So he came in with the economy that was strong, but he was able to get away with saying that he inherited a horrible economy. So the progression of and people would tell you this, like Forbes even said it. Forbes said that his economy his job growth was actually just an extension of the Obama. It was just taken off from where Obama's leveled up. He
essentially inherited the benefits of the Obama administration.
Exactly, right? So he got away with this because he's a great PR man. And he got away with telling people that his economies were so good and no other person could do it but him. Right. So people bought into that, saying that if as long as he stayed at a certain level and his economy kept performing, he would be able to walk in and still be president, and win re-election.
And that's why.
That's
why he had it where he was trying to push it throughout this pandemic. He started pushing the narrative of why it needs to reopen. The virus will just disappear. Like he said that from the very beginning. Like the virus will disappear. It'll be going by something, partially because when he spoke with President Xi Jinping, that was one of the things that they were hoping to, because from the previous SARS epidemic that happened in China in 2003, they had at least some knowledge of SARS in terms of it couldn't thrive in warm weather. However, this one proved to be a lot more resilient, and a lot more aggressive in that aspect. However, now we understand that the reason why Trump why it was politicized, and we understand that the economy was the reason behind it, because President Trump needed to use that, and the Republicans needed to push that narrative of him having a strong economy to get him reelected in office. But how did it impact voting? How did COVID impact voting?
All right, for the voting, a Pew Research poll came out around in February, March, when people start understanding the impact of the COVID-19. And what it showed was Democrats felt that it would impact the way they would vote, like go out to vote, that it would be an impediment to go out and so Trump is a person who really looks at polls.
Right.
And he realized, well, if they stay home, I'm walking through an election. But what he didn't realize was Democrats were already mobilizing, especially people like Stacey Abrams in Georgia. They were already mobilizing,
Right.
and they pushed for universal mail-in voting. Right. So when we do it to the universal mail-in voting, remember Trump came out and said, well, if they get the mail-in vote, we'll never win an election. So then he starts saying things like mail-in ballot, and this is the crazy part, because Republicans has always won because of mail-in voting. Right. That's how they win. That was one of their big things, is mail-in voting. So what happened was Democrats knew that their voters were scared and apprehensive of going out. Now Trump voters are thinking it's a hoax. This is to get rid of Trump. So they're still living their lives. He's still holding rallies. Remember, the big argument was Joe Biden used to have crowds of 100 people or 10 people. Oh, his rallies are small. That's because Democrats knew that we're not going out to no rally without masks and things like that. So he conditioned his people to go out to the polls, because the plan was to say that mail-in balloting was a fraud. And then what he did, when he started saying mail-in ballot was a fraud, he then put in things to hinder mail-in voting. Remember, he put in the joy at the post office, and one of the first acts the joy did was cut hours for postal workers. Right. And then what he started doing in Democratic areas, he started disabling processing machines to process the mail. Now, people were getting hurt where old people weren't receiving their checks on time. Right. It hindered the stimulus that we were sending out, who people were getting paid through the stimulus checks. Those were being delayed. And then the other key point that people were getting hit with was people who get their medicines through mail-in. They were getting their medicines late. So this whole thing was, but then again, this was, again, a plan that I'm going to hinder. Since Democrats, I know they're going to do mail-in voting, I'm going to hinder their chances of doing mail-in voting. And then you have Republicans, people in red states, where their governors were, the governor and the legislations were Republicans. They started removing drop boxes. Right. That became an issue of drop boxes, because they knew the Democrats were actually going to start. The most of the mail was going to be coming through for Democrats were going to be, all of their voting, most was going to be through mail.
Because we know the unspoken truth is, if everybody, like they always say in politics, but nobody really speaks on, if everybody votes the way they're supposed to in local and national elections, Republicans will never win. Democrats will usually always win.
Right, because there's more registered Democrats than there are registered Republicans. Right. So it's a numbers game, right? So but the heroes of that part was that postal workers started saying, look, they're cutting our hours, and we're noticing that we're demolishing processing machines, which is going to make it slower to process. Not only because, remember, they did this before the election, so they were saying that we can't build them up after the election. This is going to hurt mail that's supposed to get the regular mail. It's going to hinder holiday mail, and it's really going to hinder. We're not going to be able to get these ballots out on time for people votes to be counted. Courts started taking action, and that's why you started having a different turnaround, and they stopped tinkering with the postal office. However, you still had the state actors saying that they're going to take away drop boxes and things like that, making it harder for people to vote. But then he turned that from then, and the thing was to weaponize mail-in voting by having his supporters believe, it's part of the big lie that we're dealing with now, is to have to say that at the end of the election night, which has never been done before, it's saying all voting stops. Right. The declared winner would be the person who had the most votes at the end of election night. Now, Axios did a great article on this, and it was done by Jonathan Swan. And the media doesn't talk about this either, which I don't understand. What we're seeing now, what they call a big lie, was a big plan. That's what it was. It wasn't a big lie. It was a big plan. Trump at the end of election night was going to declare himself the winner, because what they knew was most of his votes would have been, his voters who were going to vote in person would have been counted. And in some states, instead of counting their votes at the same time, said that they wouldn't vote, and most of these were red states. Governors, you had Democratic governors in Philadelphia and Michigan and Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So it pushed the legislature a little bit. They couldn't do whatever they wanted to do. So what they did was they said, okay, we'll have them mail and ballot, but what we will do is we'll count them late. So those are the 3 states that Trump needed to win the election. Right. So he knew at the end of election night, he would be winning those states. And the states he needed to be winning, he wanted them outright win, was in Arizona, Georgia, Texas, and Florida. Right? If they declared him the winner, those are 4 states that you need to win the election, right? Especially for his pathway. Exactly. So if they voted it, and then at the end, and then at the end of the night, so he has all of those 4 in the box, right? But then you figure he was winning in Michigan, he was winning in Wisconsin, he was winning in Philadelphia, big, before the end of the night. So if he could declare himself the winner, he would look legit because the 4 states were called for him. But what happened was Fox threw a little bit of a wrench in his program because they declared Arizona, which was why he went ridiculously off, is they declared Arizona for Biden.
That's what he started saying on Twitter, the vote should stop, right?
Then he came out and said voting should stop. He actually declared himself the winner and said voting should stop. And then it became an argument of counting the votes after the election. So this big thing that we have about the big lie, and it's because his supporters have been conditioned to believe that all of the votes that were counted after the election was somehow illegal. And that's why we have the issues that we have now.
And that's what led to January 6th, pretty much. It's like
he
brainwashed his constituents into believing that the election was illegitimate. Like it was taken from him.
But understand,
because the voting ballot, the mail-in ballots were false. Counted. They were counted, and those were not legitimate votes. Exactly. And so that's why we have it where really January 6th, we had a bunch of radicals storm the Capitol in a coup to try to really stop the process.
Yeah, because they believed that the mail-in ballots, and remember how they talked about it. They were just dropping off ballots. They were just dropping off ballots. There were no way of knowing. They were just dropping off ballots, and they're illegal. And Trump was president at the end of the night. He conditioned them to believe this. Right. So when it happened, everybody was behind the bar. Behind the barn was the horse was out of the barn at that time. He conditioned people from the time of the pandemic start to the end that he was going to win the election. So he had a strong economy. The hoax the Democrats was going to use again. So everything that he was saying was falling into place. So if you're his supporter, you're looking. This stuff looks like it's real. They used the hoax. They did mail-in ballot, and he didn't win. And the counting of the ballots didn't happen. The winning numbers didn't come in till after election day. So and they were all mail-in ballots. So it looked like he was cheating.
So essentially, this wasn't really a big lie or a conspiracy. This was actually a plan. This was a strategized plan.
It was a strategy. And the thing about it is, Jonathan Swan article was before the election.
Yeah, it was
So it was out there that he was going to do this, but nobody did and that includes Democrats, to realize, to get out there and say, this is what he's planning. So when he did it, nobody would you could push back and say, no, he was planning this all the time. It was an article out there saying he was going to do this. He did it, but they were so behind the other foolishness he was doing is that they didn't push back hard enough to say, no, this is what he was planning to do all along. So the article came out in like November the 2nd. Before the election, that this is what he was going to do. And so when he came out at 2:00 in the night, I'm watching it and I'm like, damn, he's about to do exactly what this guy said he was going to do. And he declared himself the winner.
So now we see how this led to what happened in January 6th of 2021. How has COVID-19 been politicized in 2021?
Because it's now another strategy for Republicans gain office, right? You look at the states who don't want to wear masks. You look at the states who don't want to have vaccines. Pushing back on vaccine mandates and pushing back on mask mandates. Right, because now what you have is an energy, right? You have a group of people believing that the election was taken from their leader, their president. They believe that COVID was used to do it. They believe that the mask thing is a hoax. They believe that was done to damage the economy for Trump. They believe closing down was used to damage Trump. So now you have this base that's energized off of that. These guys are energized off of that. They're showing up at meetings, school board meetings, telling people that no, my kid's not going to wear a mask. No, we're not, you can't force us to take a vaccine, right? You know, we're not going to give you proof that we're vaccinated to go in and eat in a restaurant. So these are the things that this is what you call energy.
Right.
You win elections with energy.
Right.
Right. If your base is energized. So Republicans, that people are looking at these governors and they're realizing that as crazy as it is, this is the energy of their base. Right. The energy is their base is the rejection of COVID protocols that will keep people safe. Mm. Right. So that is their strategy to get power, to say that when Biden is doing something that is going to be beneficial for people, to say, hey, let's all get vaccinated. That is a, that's a social government takeover, right? Mm-hmm. You're going against my freedoms. These are the arguments that you're hearing, and you're like, well, you need to be vaccinated to go to right. school. Right. You can't go to school without a vaccination card, right? Right. So is it a weird strategy? Yes, but could it be a winning strategy? Yes, because they have an energized base, and they're not going to, so when you look at somebody like a DeSantis in Florida, you look at Kemp in Georgia, right? You look at these states that are, that are red, and people are wondering what they're doing. It is to keep their base energized, because you got to figure Kemp knows that Stacey Abrams is still there. He knows that Trump lost Georgia, right? So he's going to try to keep that base energized to reverse, to try to push back, because that state can definitely become a blue state. DeSantis knows he barely won. DeSantis won by like maybe 1 percentage point to become governor of Florida. He needs that energized base. Right. To push back against like any Democrat to come and say that, but what they're going to do is they'll say that this is an extension of Biden, and Biden is a socialist, and Biden won the election fraudulently. So they're the same stuff that we saw for 2020 when Trump gave us the big lie that led to January 26th to January 6th. It's the same strategy now that is being used, because understand that man got 74 million votes. Right. He got 74 million votes.
He actually brought people out to vote. And I guess that goes to the point. He's overall strategy, energize and suppress, because while they're energized,
suppressing Black votes,
as we see, and they're using the rhetoric of mail-in fraud and mail-in ballots,
and to suppress the vote, they're using the big lie, right? Which I call a big plan, because it was a plan. They're using the plan, and they're saying that the election was stolen to Trump, to actually go in and say, well, we need to make sure the votes are valid. We know the votes are valid. His own people said the votes were valid, right? So why are we doing 5 audits after there's been 3?
Hello?
3, right? So these are some of the things that are now politicizing the COVID politicization of the 2022 elections that are coming up.
And to that point, now we see in regards of COVID, like how what's a pandemic that really was started in one country, which was China, gradually became a global pandemic, and gradually really affected America, not due to just it being in China, but due to inactions of our policymaker, and how it's affected us on a local or just a domestic level, where people have been displaced economically, voting rights are being suppressed, and how it's literally led to a radicalization of a certain portion of our country,
and economically is harmed a certain sector that is going to be hard to bring back. People have lost wealth, because some people had their savings that they had to use to COVID. How do you recapture that, right? Just to stay into their homes or stay in their apartments, to feed their families. So you have again, like they say, when white America catches the cold, Black America catches the pneumonia. We're the ones who are most impacted, right? Because our savings were used up, jobs were lost. So the economic impact of COVID and the and poor and Black and brown communities is an impact that we're going to feel for a long time, because some of the jobs that were lost are never coming back. So now you have to actually now take this sector of people who lost their jobs that aren't coming back and actually re-educate them for the new jobs that might be out there.
And that goes into my point of what I was going to say in terms of how a global pandemic that started from one country became a global pandemic and is affecting us domestically, and specifically our community, African American community, brown communities, and just poor people in general. And to where this leads to my question of, and I guess I'll start off with that. What are the benefits of an international education? And does it have special benefits to a specific group of people? And I'll say like this, as I said during the introduction, we live in a global society, one that's globally, that's interconnected. We live in a global economy. Stuff that's local actually has an impact on globally, and something that's globally will impact you domestically or locally. And the benefits of an international education is you become empowered to become a better global citizen. Some of the tangible benefits are just you understanding something like a pandemic and how it can affect you, how it's affecting us economically, us understanding just interculturally on a domestic level, interculturally, how you can interact with other groups of people. Because let's be honest, America is a nation of enslaved Africans and people who are of immigrant backgrounds. So we all have a global background to come that we stem from. In order to really engage with people in this country, you really have to have some type of intercultural understanding. I think it will also have people have a better understanding of issues like immigration issues, because you get to the crux of them rather than just understanding the rhetoric. You understand how America engages with its alliances better, and how these certain policies affect them, and how these foreign policies really will affect the domestic policy, and how they will have a direct impact on you, and specifically the African American community. I think the African American community has been the community that has traditionally been a community that has not really been exposed to international relations or international education. And the consequence of it is because we are a global people, our experience is global, and we have a lot that we can offer the world in terms of insights and perspective, as well as also stuff that we can also gain from understanding.
But understand, when you say that though, right? Mm-hmm. Understand that the tactics that we use against our oppressors are the tactics that, Mandela and them learned from, they say King learned from Gandhi. However, the strategies of the civil rights movement have been practiced in other nations to get for oppressed people of color, right? When the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, that went global, right? Because there's some people of color in other nations were for actually having impacts same impacts that we were having here with local authorities and things like that. So though we're not as global as other people, our struggle is, right? And people use the tactics of our struggle that we're never given credit for, right? Our global, our struggles that we have here, the tactics that we hear to push back against the struggles that we have, people take that and use it. Right. So imagine if you start combining those forces. Exactly. You have now people upset now because, Black Lives Matter is now talking to Cuba, right? They're saying that they're picking the Cuban government. Well, your enemy is always not my enemy, right? And especially in global politics, right? So it is interesting to that, we had this discussion about civics and how it was taken out of education, right? So it was specifically, right? So what I'm saying is some of this is structured, because remember when Malcolm X was murdered, Malcolm was about to take the United States for human rights to the UN on human rights issues, and like he said, so that has always been the missing connection. Right, it's always been an international connection with our struggles. No doubt, and I mean even to let's say even something that was an unpopular war like Vietnam, you had it where like President Ho Chi, well the leader it was Ho Chi Minh. He actually understood our struggle and really was inspired by that. That's actually what was the inspiration for him. He was like, and he even said, African Americans had the hardest struggle than any group in any sense of history. And that was his inspiration in terms of
him, doing what he was doing with the Viet Cong and trying to really attack what he thought was European imperialism, because they was really originally pushing out France and America got involved. But to your point in terms of how education really is a factor, and really how civics, to the core of international education, is also civics, and really civics education, understanding how your government works, was intentionally put out of school in the 70s after this 1965, after the Voting Rights Act that empowered people to vote, and after the student protests. They understood that they couldn't have what happened again, where people were becoming empowered to understand how to vote and how to utilize their votes to argue for more rights. You had not only killing Malcolm X, but Dr. King, who they say they killed because he was actually about to have a massive economic movement coalition that just not included Black and brown people, but poor people across the board, and have a march on Washington to argue for rights. And then we know that they also was arguing against the war in Vietnam, which gradually over time throughout the decade, all going into the 70s, became an unpopular war.
In the understanding of the back in the 60s, people just see the civil rights movement, and they just see those civil rights leaders. But the real important people were the working class people who were actually contributing to those causes, right? They were contributing funds to those causes. And these people, educated children, were the soldiers of Martin Luther King. There were young kids out there battling for civil rights. The SNCCs of the world, the John Lewises, right? Those were the educated people coming out of these educated Black suburbs, right? That were the civil rights movement, right? So if you have an empowered Black people who have a voting power, that's scary. So you wanted to take civics out. So now you don't understand, because our Black people have been told for forever, your vote doesn't count. Your vote doesn't mean nothing. And I always tell to my Black brothers and sisters, if your vote didn't mean that much, why did they spend so much money and time trying to take it away from you?
Trying to take it away and promote to take it away.
And take it away from you, right? Because they understand that the worst thing is a educated voter, right? And a mobilized voter.
Right.
And that's one of the things that scared them. So you saw Nixon take civics out of teaching, because the young kids who come up and understand that structure become empowered voters. And now you from the structure of the 60s to the 70s, the voting, the decision making was based off of your citizenry, right? Our senators and governors and congressmen reported to us, pretty much, not all 100%, but it was better than now.
Right.
Now you have a corporate donor society that runs our politics. It's no longer the citizen. And until people understand that and start voting their interests, and start voting educationally, and start voting to understand internationally how things that they're doing internationally are impacting you, that allows them to keep this corporate structure that is draining us economically. The deficits that they're talking about are not being deficits drawn up by people who are working class. It's being drawn up by corporate bailouts, wars, and tax breaks. Right.
And to that point, I say, like, even in terms of us as African Americans understanding how international relations can be affected, like, we even have we're not all just enslaved Africans. Some of us come from an immigrant background. And we see this, we have a lot of Caribbeans, a lot of Africans, and specifically right now, we see our current issues being affected, where you have it where immigration, there's talking about a crisis at the border because you have immigrants coming in, and the depiction is that it's immigrants from Mexico, but the deeper background to it is that they're immigrants from Haiti. And maybe you can explain, like, why, give context to, like, why, like, they're coming from that.
Because you understand, the new media is having a crisis and then picking a side who do you choose, right? So we're getting away from, like, when we used to have like earthquakes in other countries and stuff like that. First thing you would see was Red Cross commercials, and you would bring water or whatever to try to help these people. You no longer see that type of activity. What you see is a corporate-driven thing to say, okay, we're gonna have people picking which side that they're on, right? You give you the image of these Black bodies. So now I'm watching TV and I'm like, those two, they're dark to be Mexican. Now Mexicans are dark, but they're not that dark. And then I did a little deeper dive, they were Haitians. And then you say, well, why Haitians at the Mexico coming through Mexico to get to our borders? Well, they had an assassinated president, a
Right.
collapsed government. And then when the government was collapsing, they had an earthquake. While we were spending time over in Afghanistan
Talking for the past 3
withdrawing,
weeks.
and the media wanted to make that, well, did Biden do the right thing? We look weak. We lost the war. We didn't lose a war. We didn't lose a war.
That was a
You were
negotiation.
occupying a nation, so it's
Right.
time for you to come home, right? So that was that thing. And let's be honest, if we want to have a true discussion about the Afghan government, it was corrupt. And that's why they collapsed. These people, I mean, obviously they didn't want to fight for their nation. So
Right.
it was time to come home, right? So you had that dynamic, but that was the occupation of the occupying what the media wanted to occupy. Meanwhile, you didn't even understand. We spent one day on when the Haiti guy, the Haiti president was assassinated, and then after that they had the earthquake, and you heard nothing about it. It was like, well, that's why these people are showing up on your shores. So if you're internationally educated, you're doing that deep dive. Yeah, now you're not asking why are these people here. You're asking how can we help these people.
Exactly.
And that is and if you have an international type of mindset, you would ask those questions instead of asking what are they trying to take from me. You're asking why how can we help these people get back on their feet? And those are the things that are missed out on because the type of media that we're watching are no longer meant to drive people's intellect. It is to draw you out of your emotions and get you angry. And so now that drives up ratings.
So you're not asking why, you're just reacting. And like
they reacting. Exactly.
And then you're not even becoming an informed person where you can look at it from a policy perspective and like maybe like, all right, maybe we should advocate for our politicians or our president or whoever to look at it from more of a humanitarian aspect of how can we get aid and relief and how can we actually help build infrastructure.
Exactly.
Like if we talk about Afghanistan and how we talk about nation building there, well, really Haiti is probably an example of nation building, and not just in the sense of where we're propping up a corrupt leader like a Papa Doc or something like that. Or
who we propped up for years.
We propped up for years, but actually having a global conversation of a multilateral agreements going on where we have conversations with our regional partners or regional allies and the people which are nations in the Caribbean, nations in Latin America, having more of a context of first putting the people first, having an understanding of the people their needs, and finding educated people who can adequately represent them in that government. Because part of the issue is too, you can't have a government set up and you don't have educated people or people who are knowledgeable on how to run it. I mean, that's where corruption can happen, or people who have their own interests set in place, but not that of the people. That's where you do have propped up governments where you might have an educated few, but these educated few does not represent the interests of the population.
Well, remember, during the Biden administration, they had that discussion with Mexico, Guatemala, and I forget the other nation, right? We wanted to understand the root cause. So what we wound up doing was we had an agreement with these people where, we were giving them funds. And one of the things we were going to be working on was getting better jobs for their people, cutting back on the violence and the drug trafficking, right? Well, when Trump came in, his agenda was building a wall. That was his agenda. I'm going to build the wall. So he said, "Why are we giving them money?" He rips up the deal, and then we wind up, because remember, during the Obama administration, deportations was up, and it was less border crossings, right? Those were for them to say he was weak on immigration, which is another discussion we can have. Is that where DACA came from? Obama actually did have the Senate actually had a bill that came out for immigration. It blew up in the Republican House because they didn't want to pass it. That's why DACA came out, because Obama was sitting there saying, well, I'm not going to send these 8 million people back who this is the only country they know, and most of these people are young. They fought in our military. They are in our military. They're educated. I'm not just sending them back to so that's where DACA came out of, right? So now when you look at what Trump did, he ripped up this agreement. He stopped paying the funds that we were paying to these nations, and then it started bringing back the border because he needed the imagery to say, this is why we need my wall, which Mexico never paid for, by the way. And so it is.
And it affected us domestically too, because I mean, it was a big argument about that. Money was wasted, and then he shut down the government for a good amount of time.
Shut down the government over.
Hurt our federal government and hurt a lot of people economically for the short period of time that he did for that wall. And then it goes to the contrast of policy where, Barack Obama was very hard on immigration. He was probably one, like outside of Trump, he really probably was the one that was probably hardest on immigration in terms of deportation. However, the humane aspect of it was he understood from a global perspective intricacies behind it. He had a domestic context, which you pointed out with DACA and a pathway to citizenship for people who already had asylum here in these cities, or who had kids here who literally grew up here their whole life and knew nothing about the countries their parents or ancestors came from. But he also looked at it from the context of these other countries in Latin America and Central America. Like, these are nations that have corrupt governments, don't have a great criminal justice system, adequate education or healthcare or health infrastructure. And he was trying to change the tone in terms of a more diplomatic approach rather than just a hard militarized approach, in terms of actually having it where we deliver more foreign aid or discuss having foreign aid and more adequate partnerships of investment in these countries to help them build up their infrastructure. So that way people have no reason to leave, or if they do go back, they have
But
to go back to.
even that discussion in itself too, right? There are three type of immigrants, right? Mm-hmm. Those who were enslaved, right, which is us, which I don't know how, that they forget that part, right? And then you have those who came through Europe, and mm-hmm. those who come through Central America and those type of countries, right? The struggle is still the same. The people are leaving. The people are leaving their strifes in these Latin American countries are doing the same reason that the Europeans left, but they're not being treated the same, right? There's no Ellis Island for them because they're coming through the border, and that's the part that is missing. And so if you have an international mindset. You realize that, well, your ancestors came here through that. You're Irish. Your ancestors came through Ellis Island, but you left because you were having impact. So how you want me to leave? So how am I not going to treat these people with the same care and humanity that we gave to your ancestors? Right. So those are the discussions that you have when you have international education, and then we can go into like your trips to China, me going to Mexico. When you leave the country and go to other countries, you get it like you get an education of the
dynamics of how these people live and how they live. Like when I went to China, it opened my eyes into the extent, like, for one, if you really want to know about it, people don't really know about their government. You got to really know the people to really understand the nation, the culture, understand their history. And really, like, to the root of it, you find that people are all looking for the same thing. And this was one of my classmates who was from Togo, who lived here as an American citizen, proud to be an American, served in the military and everything, now works for the Secret Service. He at one time said the point, like, people really need to get to the real of this. Most people just care about getting education for the kids, having a safe place, adequate health. Like, you give them really those core things, people really don't care. And I mean, that's the root of every nation. Like, when we was over in China, that's what the young kids were talking about. That's what, many of the people were talking about. And to their point, like they said, America, and this goes to our citizenry not really having a full education. Like they said, one of the critiques I asked that they had about us as a people or as a country was they really said that America doesn't fully understand how their policies have an impact on the people on people, especially the people in the countries that they're interacting with, and not in a good way. Like, they really had a negative out. Like they felt we don't think of the ramifications, don't really understand.
You could look at the embargo that lasted, that Obama tried to end in Cuba. I mean, the bottom line is the embargo hurts the Cuban people more than it hurts the Cuban government.
Exactly. So it's just coming to, and I mean, there's a discussion now how we say sanction in international relations now. A lot of scholarships talk about this debate: do sanctions adequately work? And I mean, we can even go from there to even what happened with the Iran nuclear deal, which is another thing. We talked about how during the Obama administration, when he made the deal, there was tone, especially from, the Republican side, that said that was a weak deal. It wasn't a great deal. However, with the context that was taken out was, for one, it was a multilateral deal. What was never heard of was in the United Nations was the fact that, you had all the nations in the Security Council who had veto power, were all on a consensus or accord. I think Russia was the only nation that agreed that they would abstain from a vote, but literally every nation, including China, agreed that there should not be any nuclear weapons proliferation.
And then the argument was always that it was a weak deal. But the people who said it was a weak deal never told you how they could have made it a better deal. And one of the things that we really learned, what we found out over the last
4
years after he ripped the bill up, is that
President Trump
didn't have a better deal. It goes back to even sort of like, we always told that we would get a better healthcare bill, right? And once they tried to rip it up, and for 10 years, we found out that they never had a better bill. They always talked about ripping up we can rip up the Iran nuclear deal and we'll get a better deal. But what they never told you was that even the Israeli army said that it was working, because nobody could find proof that they weren't following the deal. All the nations were saying that they were following the deal. So the deal, you didn't have a better deal. That was a good deal, because a good deal means that if everyone's following the deal, it's a good deal.
Right. And then the fact that you had no boots on the ground to try to enact it, it was a very good deal. And to make it even to a local context, you had it where we didn't have to send troops abroad to fight, so no loss of life on Americans' behalf. And then America benefited from it, because not only did you have a region, at least partially, where you didn't have to worry about the intensification of violence in the Middle East, or you didn't have to worry about nuclear proliferation, but domestically, we benefited from the fact that we lifted sanctions from Iran and allowed them, started lifting some of the sanctions from Iran, and allowed them to actually enter the market with oil. That allowed it where now we have more oil on the market. And just to get in terms of economics in the global economy, it's basic supply and demand. Our supply of the oil was bigger than the demand, where now we had such an abundant supply. We had it where oil was less. So gas was very cheap under the Obama administration during that time when we had
at the end. Yes, they started dropping.
The ramifications was during the Trump presidency was gas gradually went up, because he did away with the deal, and arbitrarily so, where it caused a rift between many of our allies, including our European allies, because
it hurt us because you got to understand one thing, and one of the things that's missing is what Merkel said, and people just look at it from a Trump perspective.
Right.
What Merkel said is that you no longer can trust America to do.
What it says it's going to do, because now you
we need to start looking out for Europeans. Need to start looking out for Europeans, because we no longer can trust America. And the reason that they say this is because people forget Bush went it alone when we went into Iraq.
Right.
He didn't have the consensus of the rest of the world. So now that you have Obama, he smooths everything back over. We're looking like globalists. Everybody's getting along, except Russia. That's a different discussion. But what happened was Trump comes in and he blows it back up. So now, if you're another nation, you're saying, well, we only can have peace every 4 years, because the next president could come in and rip up every deal that we just agreed to. So now you have our allies saying, like, how much confidence they can have in us.
Exactly.
So those are the type of things that, if we speak out louder, if Trump heard more voices from his own people who supported him, don't rip up the deal, he would have never ripped up the deal.
Right. And
what I'm saying is, you have an international education, and you have an international, and you have a more educated voter block, and now you're challenging the people who you vote for. Right. You're now it even changes the foreign policy. Right. The way that they act, they're not going to act on our behalf if we have a voice on that. But exactly. If the voice is not heard, they do whatever they want, and you just live with the fallout.
Right. And I mean, we've seen the fallout. I mean, like you said, it disrupted our influence, so we lost our soft power in terms of us having influence. Nobody really trusts our word. Again, the price of oil increases, and anything that related to oil, so products that are made as a byproduct of oil increase. Russia became more of a dominant power in that, because part of that deal, what nobody talks about, is the other countries that did oil. So like Saudi Arabia with OPEC, they didn't like it because, it wasn't a Sunni Shiite type of rivalry that, the media would try to portray. It had less to do with Islam and more to do with money. Saudi Arabia didn't want Iran to benefit from the fact of them getting oil on the market, because that would be something they could compete with. When there's more oil on the market, less money. So less money that Saudi Arabia gets. When it's
So
more oil on the market, when it's less oil on the market, it means the price of oil goes up. More likely you buy more Saudi oil and their pockets benefit. But Russia, which is also a net export of oil as well, they were hindered by it as well, because again, when Barack Obama put sanctions on Russia, you had it too where those were economic sanctions where you say all the time, Putin drowned in his oil. Putin was known to be an exporter of oil, especially from giving it to Europe. But now that you had all this oil coming from Iran too, Europeans were actually benefiting from the trade of oil as well. So that's also partially why our allies were upset.
But this is the thing too. Remember, Putin was voiceless in the last few years of Obama administration, right? The people got mad because Obama said he was just a regional power. He was.
Right.
Trump took him off the sidelines, and then he became emboldened. And then you got to figure he even gave a face to Kim Jong-un,
right?
Who was, he legitimized him by having meetings with him.
Right.
So it was then he sat down with Erdogan, became more.
These authoritarian leaders.
These are authoritarian leaders that he was aligning with, and now our allies are looking at us like, "Whoa, what is he doing? Is he trying to become a dictator?" And after January 6th, I questioned that myself: was he trying to become a dictator?
And I think to go on too, like we can look at it in terms of how, again, domestically stuff, international with a global mindset, you see how other things over in other countries affect us politically here, because if people question the rise of Trump or where Trump got his strategies from, for one, you have to look at the context of the time in 2015 and 2016. You had it also where there wasn't a massive radical right-wing movement or influx over here in America, where the Republicans took over, Trump became president, and they came with a more radical right-wing type of rhetoric. But you had that in other European countries as well. And who Trump got his strategy from was a victim. Was
Troy?
Yes.
I'm sorry. This is Marie from DINSN Comms team.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting close to a little past the hour, and we like to open up for Q&A.
That's fine.
Sure, that's fine.
That's fine.
Okay.
That's fine. We rambled on.
Okay.
Let's just conclude to say like this: with a more globalized, with more globalized education and a more globalized mindset, you start looking at, as you become a more educated, equipped, and empowered citizen to be able to vote for politicians or vote for policies that fit more your interests. You look at certain situations differently. You look at how policies are enacted differently. And you can take something like this with the COVID-19. You can look at how the issue that happened in another country can affect you and affect you directly on a local level, and see what things and question what things that need to be done to impact that, to have for better solutions. We can now go to the Q&A session.
So I don't.
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
So do you believe that with regards to COVID or post-COVID-19 environment, you're going to see more or less Americans studying abroad? And because this is such an important thing as far as in the 21st century, we need more of our next generation to be able to acquire international awareness, especially learn about emerging threats, emerging sectors, if you want to be an international entrepreneur.
Right. You want me to answer this first, Dad, or you want?
You can go. Yeah.
I want to say yes, because I mean, even now, like part of the problem is like why COVID is still spreading is people still want to travel, people still want to go out. I mean, the fact that we opened up this summer, people have been traveling. I do think people will travel again, and I can speak more for my generation. We are more global centered, where younger people do want to travel. That's what we look for, jobs, or we look for industries that we can get into that allows us to travel, and will pay for us to travel. So I do think that, even past this pandemic, people will travel and travel globally. However, I do think especially if you want to push them in the direction of, national security or foreign policy, government needs to do a better job of, advocating or creating more programs or making more aware, because there are programs, but making more aware of programs about that, especially for certain communities, showing the advantages to traveling abroad, as well as really just like, as well as just really doing a better job of just really informing people about it. Because I think part of the thing is people think that travel is not affordable. You don't have, travel is really not that expensive. And people really, once people really know the benefits of travel or see it more relatable to them, they will travel. And if they know what it can look like in the experience, like part of the problem with us not having people is like, they don't see enough Black people in foreign policy or national security to see what that can look like for them. When it comes to international business, there need to be better pipeline programs to allow that. If when you have that, I think you will have it where you will have people, especially young people, willing to travel.
But I think first because you got to understand, you now have different criteria of like nations allowing you into their countries, right? You know, so COVID has to be one of our major things to open up travel that we're talking about. But as far as the exposure of having people of color, one of the things that, you know, schools, I think that we can start doing to open the kids' minds is when kids are younger, they have imaginations. And through those imaginations, you have to do things like have days where you have a classroom set up like it's cubed or it's set up, and you give the cultural awareness. You have to have a cultural awareness to make people intrigued to want to go to these nations, right? And then when they get to the high school level, you know, this is the thing that used to, now that I look back on it, when I was in high school, some of the white kids was going abroad then. They were doing abroad trips, but it would be through classes that they weren't telling us about, or we weren't getting that information. So I think a broad program at the high school level to allow our kids to travel. You open their mind up in elementary and grammar schools of the different places that you can go. And then when you get to the high school level, you give them the opportunity to go. So now when they come into college, they are global students, right? We come we're a lot behind the 8 ball when we come into college, where these kids done traveled the world already. Right. And so I think that's one of the things that we have to work on is giving access to our children when they're ready to go, but giving them the culture awareness of and the imagination to travel to these countries. So that's one of the things that I think should be done.
Okay. Is there another question? If not, it's one thing I did want to say that we didn't touch on that we wanted to, which is like, say like international education doesn't mean you have to go to school necessarily, or it doesn't mean that just because you have a degree that you're open-minded and that it stops. And one of the things I would ask is like, you know, what are sources that you look at to, you know, get globally educated or educated in terms of things that are going on?
Like I said, you know, one of my professor, Dr. Ajiman, used to always make us read the Washington Post, New York Times, and we'd take international conversations that were happening in those papers, and we would come in and have a class discussion on some of the topics that were going on those levels. Me now with social media, I go to like things like the Raw side, the Raw Story, which posts articles from different sources, and you can read like what's going on it has a left wing swing. I'm not going to left wing swing to it, but they are source articles. I try to stay away from opinion pieces. And these are people who go out and they're journalists, and they put good articles out. Axios is another source that I read from as well.
And for myself, I do Political, Axios, The Economist, Vox, VOX Media. They're very good, like kind of like what you said. They're source-based as well, where not only do they give you the article, a lot of this stuff is now social media connected. So like they put videos on social media that explains their articles, but it's all source-based, where they'll give you the original sources where they got it from. The Atlantic does this as well, is another source, as well as specifically for just foreign policy or international relations, foreign policy or foreign affairs. BBC is also good. So those are all great sources and I think also just to point out, because of social media, these sources, these news outlets now are on social media as well. They have their own social media pages, whether it be on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, as well as some of them have video. A lot of them have videos on YouTube where they have segments and video recordings or small documentaries on YouTube or videos to watch. So to educate yourself on, and again, they're source based. So they're giving you the sources or the articles that this information is coming from and talking to experts. So I think these are just things that casual things that people can do for it. And not, it don't have to be all day, like 30 minutes to an hour a day, really, just to get yourself really knowledgeable and well versed. And you'll begin to just start seeing the stuff that you see on the news and start questioning it or start pushing back on it. Or just really saying that,
Asking questions.
asking the important questions of what are they not actually showing you or they're not talking about.
Okay, if there are no any other questions,
There's one more question in there. Are there resources you would recommend for classroom, high school? Yeah, our really resources, like I said now, I would really get high school students started into reading the New York Times, like even if it's just one article. The Economist, reading the article, again, Vox, all the sources we just listed, like I don't pander to the idea that high school students are not smart enough to understand that stuff. Like just to even get their reading comprehension skills up, you should have them reading articles. But
Don't forget I would say New York Times and Washington Post.
Washington Post.
Yeah, I would have them read those. Even the Wall Street Journal. So you're not just doing, the Wall Street Journal is more right wing. Have a right swing, swing to it. So, so you're not just, because I believe you should read everything, not just one. You have to. Yeah, I remember people used to think I was crazy because I would watch Fox News. But I used to do it because I want to know where this stuff is coming from.
And then I think too, just outside of that, like just for high school students, because I know people don't really like to watch TV and stuff. There are different podcasts or different YouTube videos. Like I caution with YouTube because I know like you get a lot of conspiracy theories on YouTube, but if they come from news-based sources and stuff like that, show the documentaries. I know when I was teaching high school students, like teacher would when I was working with the teacher, we would get them videos on YouTube that had stuff from Vox News, PBS. Netflix does a good job with some documentaries they have as well, and just or even certain movies as well that have a historical base content to it. As the teacher, I would give more historical context, whether you're giving a class discussion before or afterwards, or even having them read about that. And I would say even outside of just political or substance stuff, really with high school students, start having them read stuff or work with stuff that talks about negotiation or people skills, emotional intelligence, because my perspective is like you'll get a lot of smart people, well-informed people. They don't really have a lot of great people skills. And that includes people in this field specifically. Like not everybody has people skills. Those are acquired skills over time. And the sooner you get them started, the better.
So can I ask you just a follow-up question, both of you?
Sure.
How do you suggest getting schools, public schools in particular, to buy into, I should say, more structured programs like foreign exchange, travel abroad, the UN program that they have for high schoolers? Because I agree with you, we should implement on a daily basis reading the New York Times and things like that. But sometimes I think it has to come in a more structured form. So how do we get our public school administrators to buy into these structured forms?
Well, Duke, you could, he's Troy Jr., but I call him Duke. Well, you could talk about what you did with Seton Hall, right? Seton Hall, and you navigating they had a pilot school in Newark that you married into Seton Hall, and so that is a different way of. Yeah. You can talk about it more than I
guess. Yeah. So I guess the idea is, so when I worked for Seton Hall, as a consultant, we had facilitated a deal with a magnet high school in Newark called the Newark School of Global Studies, and they specifically focused their curriculum on international relations and international business. And they did it where they the first 2 to 3 years will focus on courses that were modeled after Seton Hall's 3 courses on international relations, introduction to IR, ethnopolitical relations, and I'm drawing a blank on the third, and international security. And then they had made it 2-track where if you were doing international business, you would study Mandarin and learn about Chinese history and culture. Or if you're doing something like diplomacy, you would study Arab or Arab history and culture. And then after that, like around their junior, senior year, they would start doing internships and try to do study abroad where they get them abroad. So I think really with high schools to get it, it goes with, it's different. It's not a silver bullet thing. One is getting parents involved. Like if parents make the demand for it and get involved in student boards, that school will adjust to it. The school politics will adjust to it, and they'll find the money for it. So I think that's one of the key aspects is really just getting parents involved, having these parent teacher conferences, and for the ones that are there involved to do it, and then really just kind of highlight to the administration or to these parents or to the students even the benefits of traveling abroad. Like get people who had those experiences, and they don't have to be full-fledged adults or career people. I would have like people, students in college who did study abroad courses or did things study abroad, or just people who had that background, because you'd be surprised. Like for one, I think it would be more relatable to them because they're closer in age, but two, like when they actually hear firsthand about people's experiences, that gets them interested, kind of to which my dad made the point of cultural emergence. Like I remember when I first got to college, this young man, he was said straight up like, you know, study abroad. And he was like, look, I'm from Orange, I'm from the hood. Like, you know, I knew nothing about study abroad, this and that, until he went to China. And he was so just amazed by the culture. Like he started learning Mandarin. He took courses in Mandarin where I would literally have him in mid conversation. He would run up to a Chinese student, another Asian or Chinese student, start switching mid conversation in Mandarin, things like that. He knew about the culture in terms of he knew they had a hip hop or dance culture there because that's what he was about, and really was engaged with that. And that for me, that planted the seed in me to want to study abroad, to where once I did get to graduate school, I did study abroad, and seeing some of the stuff that some of my friends or some of my classmates would post on social media with stuff with some of their adventures of studying abroad made me interested. Like there was this thing in college they have my lady did that in college. They call it study at sea, where you take a cruise and venture across that sea. So different things like that. The government actually do have programs like there are organizations like ICAP and other programs where they do sponsor study abroad, even for high school students. So really just making them aware about that. And then really, I think also then just showing educators and showing administrators, like getting people like Asha or people are part of the DISN, Diversity and National Security Network, involved in coming to these schools and talking to these students, letting them know what career paths can be open to them in international relations, whether it be, you you working for the State Department, or you working for a security field, or you really or you even working for a think tank, or you doing something in international business. Part of educators, when administrators are well knowledgeable about that, their goal is to get you educated and get you ahead for college. When they realize that colleges are looking for that jobs are looking for that, when parents are aware of that, I think that's where you'll have the drive for them wanting to. And then when you have it relatable to the students where they're engaged and they're interested, you'll have it where programs will want to actually start for structured programs like that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. That you got a perspective about that?
I think you read everything.
Do you see any other questions there?
No, I think that was it.
That was it.
Okay, so that was excellent. DINSN would love to thank both of you, Troy Dorsch Sr. and Troy Dorsch Jr.
Yes.
Your wealth of information. It was a very enlightening hour or so, and we appreciate you taking your time to come in and have this panel with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invite.
Thank you, DINSN, for the invite. Thank you, the Tinker Institute, for also being a sponsoring organization, as well as my company, 3 Doors Consulting. And thank you everybody again for attending and joining.
Thank you. Okay. Take care.
Everybody enjoy their weekend.